I'd first of all like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and in the spirit of reconciliation, pay my respects to their elders past and present. As we all know, last weekend the Prime Minister gave a speech to mark the 125th anniversary of Sir Henry Parkes' famous Tenterfield oration. As an Australian coming to talk about federation, I'm a little embarrassed to say I know little about the Tenterfield oration. As I understand it, Parkes had been to a meeting in Queensland which had been something of a failure, determined to salvage something from the trip. He took the train to Tenterfield, a 7-hour journey, and gave what turned out to be a remarkable speech, which is widely regarded as having set federation in train in Australia. It's interesting because two things strike me about that story, if it's correct. One is that speeches really can start events, and two, how almost haphazard great speeches in history have tended to be. I've been wondering whether you could do a comparison between Parkes' Tenterfield oration and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Lincoln's address was, of course, similarly a very great speech, but it was almost haphazard in its construction and delivery. And one point that has been made to me often about Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is no modern press officer would have ever allowed the President to make it, full stop, thank you very much. I wonder if a modern press officer for a modern Prime Minister would have allowed Henry Parkes to make the Tenterfield oration. But I guess that's a question that we won't have to answer today. The current Prime Minister used the occasion on the weekend to set out the reasons why his government is committed to reform the Federation and to emphasise the importance of getting consensus from states, territories and local government if there's going to be any real prospect of progress. The Commonwealth is very clear that reform of the Federation is not something it can do unilaterally. The process needs to involve the state and territory governments and local governments and the general public and organisations such as this in diagnosing the problems and agreeing and supporting the way forward. Now, it's important to start with the proposition that our federation is not a failure. On the contrary, our federal system has contributed to making Australia one of the most successful nations in the world. You can't do that with a completely dysfunctional system of federation. Our peaceful, prosperous and pluralist democracy is a real achievement that Australians should be, in my view, proud of. But our federation is not perfect. And in a competitive world, we can't rest on our laurels. Major changes to our federal system can only occur sustainably in a spirit of mutual respect for the legitimate democratic authority of all the governments involved as responsible and sovereign in their own spheres. So the White Paper on the reform of the Federation, which my department has the pleasure and sometimes the pain of writing, although we're a long way from writing it yet, that the White Paper needs to be done in genuine partnership with a view to reforming roles and responsibilities to ensure, as far as possible, that each level of government is sovereign in its own sphere, to use the Prime Minister's terms. The main problem we seem to face in relation to roles and responsibilities is one of democratic accountability. The Commonwealth is now so involved in areas traditionally regarded as the responsibility of other levels of government that it's very difficult for voters to know which level of government they should hold accountable for success or failure in areas such as health, education and housing. Sometimes difficult for bureaucrats to know as well. Lack of accountability blunts the incentives for undertaking genuine reform because it means you can always blame the other level of government for failing to provide enough funding, which is something the Commonwealth commonly hears from the states, or failing to deliver outcomes, which is something the states commonly hear from the Commonwealth. It also means that significant change in many areas is subject to long and drawn-out negotiations between levels of government over policy, regulation and funding. It leads to frustration and disillusionment amongst voters about the ability of government to solve the problems by working together. Evidence of this frustration can be seen in the results of the 2014 Australian Constitutional Values Survey. That survey showed a sizable percentage of the community, 36%, does not think our federal system is working well, and that there is a high degree of overall support for the reform of federation. That said, it is again worth emphasising, for all the frustrations it causes policymakers and for all the delight that our federation sometimes gives headline writers and op-ed piece writers, we still have a federation which functions tolerably well. We do better than just muddle through in Australia. We've arrived at the current situation through a combination of factors, but it might not be unreasonable to characterise them as this. The Commonwealth's superior fiscal firepower has presented a temptation to a succession of state governments to invite, encourage, entreat, indeed inveigle the Commonwealth financial aid into areas of their responsibilities, and for the Commonwealth to seek to exercise greater and possibly undue influence over the way the states go about their business. Both Commonwealth and states have contributed to the current shall we say, sometimes confusing overlapping series of roles and responsibilities. In terms of reform, we can continue the incremental approach that we have been doing, with all its frustration, friction and waste and inefficiency. But we will probably evolve in the right direction. Probably. The Commonwealth will continue to put the states, under these circumstances, on the financial drip feed, and the states will continue to reform their services to make them more efficient and to meet their ever tighter budgets that they would face. Now that's more or less business as usual, but it doesn't solve our fundamental problems. It also means that the well-established principle of subsidiarity will continue to be honoured more in the breach than in the observance. This principle, by the way, states that the responsibility for the allocation of and regulation of public goods and services should be devolved to the maximum extent possible, consistent with the national interest. This means that government is accessible and accountable to the people most affected by their decisions, and it's an important principle in federal reform. The key to addressing the problem may well be, or does lie, in vertical fiscal imbalance. This financial year, the states and territories will receive around $100 billion of the $230 billion they spend from the Commonwealth. That is, on average, they depend on the Commonwealth for almost 45% of the funding they need to meet their spending responsibilities. Of that $100 billion, $54 billion is the GST, and the rest is in other grants which are tied in various ways. This disparity contributes to our accountability problems and reduces the incentives for the states to look at their own revenue base to address their budgetary problems. It is sometimes easier for the state governments to look to the Commonwealth's revenue base rather than their own. There are two ways you can address VFI. Either some state expenditure responsibilities should be transferred to the Commonwealth, or the states should take on or receive greater revenue-raising responsibilities, or you could combine both. The first approach would involve the Commonwealth taking over some additional policy and program functions that are currently the responsibility of the states. This doesn't necessarily mean the Commonwealth taking over responsibility for delivery of those programs, nor does it imply a single service delivery model in every state and territory. It could, at least theoretically, involve funding for such services delivered through an individual entitlement, supplied through a contestable market. The market could comprise competing providers, similar to the NDIS or Job Services Australia. It is, of course, not just funding roles that need to be sorted out under this model. Other roles, as who takes the lead on major policy questions, who regulates what and who delivers services, would also need looking at. The more commonly discussed option is additional state revenues. Now, we need to be clear that this is not the Commonwealth simply giving more money to the states for their existing responsibilities. That's not on the Commonwealth's agenda. So while looking at the division of expenditure roles and responsibilities, it is equally important to look at tax reform, which is why the Federation White Paper and the Tax White Paper are progressing in lockstep. You can't ignore the revenue issues as much as we would like, but it is equally important, as Stephen said, that the revenue issues don't become the whole of the story. The first thing we have to get right is roles and responsibilities. If we look at the tax side of the equation and how it might affect the federal question, we need to remember that the Commonwealth priority for tax reform is lower, simpler and fairer taxes, not higher ones. The government's made very clear that the net result of reform of the Federation will not be higher Commonwealth taxes. Despite the introduction of the GST in 2000 and the reduction in corporate and personal income tax rates over the last decades, the contribution of indirect taxes to government revenues is actually lower now than it was in 1950-51. And the indirect tax contribution tends to shrink over time as it grows more slowly than personal income taxes, and there is no reason why that won't continue in the future. In relation to priorities for taxes, in the area of corporate taxes, the international trend has been for countries to lower the corporate tax rates. In Australia, we've done quite a bit of this by broadening the base so as not to sacrifice too much revenue. We cannot ignore that trend and continue to stay internationally competitive as a country. So, from the Commonwealth's point of view, the future has to hold significant corporate tax cuts in it. On the income tax side, fiscal drag, or bracket creep, will mean that by 2015-16, a person on average total full-time earnings of $80,000 will have a marginal rate of 39%, a marginal personal income tax rate of 39%, including the Medicare levy. This means that personal income tax cuts have to come back on the agenda as well, and before too long. If the priority for the Commonwealth is to reduce our reliance on direct taxes to cut corporate and personal tax rates, then that will mean less revenue from those sources that the Commonwealth could dispense to the states. How do the states get the revenue they need to address their current expenditure responsibilities? As the Prime Minister said on Saturday night, the Commonwealth is ready to work with the states on a range of tax reforms that could permanently improve the states' tax bases, including changes to the indirect tax base with compensating reductions in income tax. And compensation, as we know from the 2001 GST experience, is of course a very expensive issue and one that is all too easily forgotten. The structure of our federation tends to reduce the incentives for the states to reform their own tax bases. Because the states don't raise every marginal dollar they spend, they may have less reason to make better use of the efficient tax bases they have. As a result either of interstate competition or intrastate political competition, the states have continued to rely on relatively inefficient taxes, such as the stamp duty and insurance taxes, and to underutilise their more efficient tax bases, such as land and payroll taxes. Genuine tax reform to address vertical fiscal imbalance as part of reform of the Federation will require both the Commonwealth and the states to look at their tax bases. And if we all look together at our tax bases, rather than having to move on them individually, there's a better chance of success of getting a better outcome on the tax system than if we don't look at it together. But again, VFI is not the only issue. Clearly, the way we equalise the fiscal capacity of the states is causing difficulties for some states, so we do need to look at how these issues might be addressed without compromising on the broad equity principle that is fundamental to our federation. We now have a situation in which the Northern Territory is receiving over 5.5 times the amount of GST it would receive if GST was distributed on a strict per capita basis. That's a lot of money. whereas Western Australia is receiving only 38% of what it would receive on a per capita basis. The White Paper will be looking at whether there are plausible alternatives to the current system that are acceptable to the Commonwealth and the states and territories as a basis for both for changing the current fiscal equalisation arrangements. What is often not recognised in the debate about how the GST is distributed for the purposes of horizontal fiscal equalisation is that this is not simply a welfare measure, one involving the stronger state economies helping out the weaker states. Some of the HFE equalisation is necessary in recognition that we share a single currency, and the weaker states can't devalue their currency to trade out of economic difficulty. In other words, the weaker Australian states have the same problem as the weaker states in the EU. The divergences just aren't as great. The other thing to remember about the HFE debate is that, despite some claims to the contrary, the current methodology used by the Commonwealth Grants Commission does not act as a serious disincentive to the states reforming their tax bases. And we need to ensure that any reforms are actually going to improve outcomes for citizens and not just an exercise in bureaucratic housekeeping. This means that the case for change has to be made to citizens on the basis that what we're doing will produce better outcomes for them, not just produce a nicer set of bureaucratic books. For example, advances in information and communications technology open up plenty of opportunities for greater collaboration between all three levels of government in the areas of online service delivery for millions of transactions between citizens and government each year. There's also the possibility that the reform of the Federation could open up opportunities for better information sharing between different levels of government, so that policies and programs can be improved on the basis of a more robust evidence base. Major reform of this kind, as we all know, is not easy. Previous attempts to look at roles and responsibility have not come to very much, with the notable exception of the National Competition Policy in the 1990s. Similarly, the GST revisions in 2000 came to something, but only because there was the unanimous support of the states and territories for GST reform. One of the key factors in both reforms was the ability of the political leadership of Australia to build a strong case for and consensus about the need for reform and the broad directions of that reform. We hope to replicate that. Throughout the White Paper process, the Commonwealth will be consulting with the states and territories and local government on all major issues, activities and documents. The terms of reference released on the 28th of June and the issues paper released on 12 September were both workshopped with state territory officials via the steering committee of senior officials that was established by COAG in May. That will also be the case for the forthcoming issues paper on housing, health, education and federal financial relations, which are due, well, most of them anyway, before the end of the year. Feedback from stakeholders on these issues papers will inform the Green Paper, which is due to be released around the middle of the year. The agenda for the reform of the Federation is an ambitious and challenging one and requires goodwill and long-term thinking from all of us, governments and citizens alike. Hopefully, that does not make it impossible. And some reform is like to be better than none. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, as they say. Achieving medium-sized steps on the way to a better set of federal arrangements is to be preferred to no progress at all on a big bang option. After all, no one got everything they wanted in relation to the federal constitution. It was a compromise between quite different positions. I suspect reform of the Federation over the next few years has also to be a compromise between differing positions. That will importantly require consultation and continuous consultation and debate between governments and citizens and between citizens. I look forward to CEDA playing an important role in this public debate. What you've done so far has been extremely valuable in kicking the debate along. It's a big issue for Australia. It's one of the bigger issues that we face, making our federation work better. A federation for the future of Australia is not quite the federation we have today, and I think that should encourage all of us to get involved, get stuck in, talk about the issue, and hopefully come up with the right compromise between our differing positions that will kick us a lot further along in terms of a competitive federation. Thank you very much.